The recent meeting at the White House between Trump on the one hand and Starmer, Macron, Merz, Meloni, Stubb, Zelensky, von der Leyen and Rutte on the other hand produced nothing of significance and most certainly produced nothing new. In essence, the meeting reaffirmed that the British and the European ruling elites want the war in Ukraine to continue, while Trump is happy to make money from the warmongering endeavours of the British and the Europeans. The meeting at the White House, which was extremely choreographed, was inevitably spun by the corrupt and deceitful Western mainstream media as a, quote, success. Yet, what exactly was successful about it? The British and the European leaders left the meeting droning on about security guarantees for Ukraine. Their words were vague and amounted to nothing. Then, approximately 24 hours after the meeting in the White House, Trump inevitably announced that US troops would not be deployed to Ukraine. British mainstream journalists immediately began squirming. Where will we and our European allies get 100,000 soldiers from to protect the 1,200-kilometre front line in Ukraine? Where will we get 300,000 soldiers from to ensure the continuing rotation of policing the ceasefire in Ukraine? The reality is that so-called security guarantees to Ukraine mean nothing in practice without being backed up by US troops in Ukraine. However, there is a far more brutal reality that the British and the European ruling elites, along with their media, is not talking about. And that is, the Kremlin has reiterated that it will never permit NATO troops in Ukraine. The Russians are acutely aware, as anyone with just a few brain cells should be, that if NATO troops were to enter Ukraine, then Ukraine would become a de facto member of NATO. Odessa and Ochakov would be NATO ports. Kiev, Sumy, Kharkov and Dnipropetrovsk would host NATO strategic missiles. And the whole of Ukraine would be occupied by tens of thousands of NATO troops, backed up by tens of thousands of pieces of NATO hardware. In short, Ukraine would be an enormous NATO base and staging ground for threatening the national security of the Russian Federation. And let me be abundantly clear. NATO troops in Ukraine would amount to a NATO bayonet, free to strike at the Russian heart. Thus, the Kremlin will never permit NATO troops in Ukraine, which means that talk about security guarantees to Ukraine and talk about where the bases of the so-called coalition of the willing would be in Ukraine is simply poppycock. Now, before I move on, I would like to bring a very important matter to your attention. People have been deliberately misled by Western mainstream media and so-called experts in the West regarding Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. So, allow me to clarify. If Article 5 is invoked, this does not force a NATO member to either go to war or to deploy its soldiers. Because Article 5 states that an attack on one NATO member is an attack on all NATO members, and each member agrees to take, and I quote, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force, end quote, to restore stability to the military bloc. The crucial sentence is, as it deems necessary. That can mean military force or non-military force. Returning now to the topic in hand, namely Ukraine. As you know, I believe a secret agreement has been made between Trump and Putin over Ukraine. And I will not go over the details of that secret agreement because you already know what I have said about it. But I will say this. On account of Trump's loathing of the British and the European ruling elites, especially the former, I believe that the US president has led them down a blind alley because he and his military and intelligence chiefs know that Russia is winning on the battlefield in Ukraine and that the Kremlin will never countenance NATO troops in Ukraine. But then, the British and the European ruling elites know this, and by that I do not mean the moronic puppets such as Starmer, Macron, Merz and Maloney. No, I mean their masters, monarchies, aristocracies, banking elites, military chiefs, intelligence chiefs and so on. Thus, if the elites know this, then what are they playing at? I strongly suspect that they have instructed their puppets, such as Starmer, to go along with Trump's peace initiative, so that they can present themselves as people of peace, while behind the scenes they are trying to prolong the war in Ukraine in the unrealistic hope of defeating the Russian army there. Remember, the Western ruling elites are masters of illusion and masters of deceit. So, to clarify my position, I believe, as I always have, that the war in Ukraine will be determined on the battlefield and that the Russian army will never walk away from Ukraine with just Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye and Kherson. The only way that Russia can ensure that Ukraine never joins NATO is for the Russian military to capture either all or most of the country. This is the only opportunity that Russia has to prevent Ukraine's accession to NATO. There will not be another. Now that the Russian military is in Ukraine, the Kremlin will take the opportunity before it. Be in no doubt of that. Before I close, I will make some other points. Firstly, Western mainstream media described Starmer, Macron, Merz, Maloney, Stubb, von der Leyen and Rutte as, and I quote, hard hitters. This is inversion at its most inverted. Those individuals are self-serving, cancerous non-entities who are repressing and betraying their own people and who are committing some of the worst crimes against humanity in human history. They are dregs of society. Secondly, the British and the European ruling elites claim they are cash-strapped. Yet they have announced that they will buy, for Ukraine, $100 billion worth of US military equipment. That is our money. The money of the ordinary man and woman in Britain and in continental Europe. The truth is that the elites have all the money in the world at their disposal, and they hate us with such hatred that they want us gone, hence why they are attempting to replace us. And thirdly, the photograph of the British and the European leaders seated before Trump was akin to pupils seated before their headmaster, and demonstrates that the likes of Starmer have no self-respect. Finally, and this does not relate to Ukraine, I have been asked about the so-called anti-Vučić protests in Serbia. Let me remind you that ever since the 5th of October 2000, when Otpor, a Western-conceived and Western-directed movement, overthrew President Slobodan Milosevic, Serbia has been a colony of the West, which means that all of its presidents and prime ministers since Milosevic have been handpicked and installed by the Western ruling elites. They are puppets and quislings. That is why Serbia officially wants to join the European Union, and why EU flags adorn the buildings of towns and cities across Serbia. And that is also why Serbia participates in NATO exercises. Further, that is why Serbia has supplied weapons to the Ukrainian government during the war in Ukraine, and why Serbia supplied weapons to Islamist groups, including Al-Qaeda, during their war against Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. All of you know that I talk bluntly, and I will not spare anyone with what I am about to say. If you cannot see that Serbia is occupied and controlled by the West, then you are not only extraordinarily ignorant, but you are also as thick as two short planks and cannot be helped in life. Thank you, as ever, for listening.